The phenomenon of plutocracy, of gross inequality in human society, arrives no later than the rise of Uruk, back more than 5,000 years ago. When we look at the oldest written documents we have, the most common symbols are for numbers. But the most common non-numerical symbol we find is that for female slave brought from someplace distant. Male slave brought from someplace distant is not that far behind. The oldest work of literature we possess, The Man Who Saw the Things of the Deep, what we call the Epic of Gilgamesh. It starts with the city of Uruk under what appears to be the absolute rule of King Gilgamesh. His actions appear to be only constrained by the gods, and not always by them. Gilgamesh can, without limit, command the young men to train and fight and work and build for him. He can command the women to cook and clean and serve and service him. Such a style of life, one in which you engross far more than your equal share of society's resources, by virtue of being good at, and hence being a thug with a spear, notionally being a good shepherd of the people, protecting them from wolves, comes only with the Agrarian-Age. And do note that the protection offered is of a peculiar kind. The standard metaphor is of the, quote, good shepherd of the people. But the shepherd does not protect the sheep because he wants the sheep to live their best lives for the longest possible time. The shepherd wants wool, milk, and meat. That is what, in his view, the sheep are for. He is not their servant. They are not his companions. They are not his tent mates. They are not his friends. To the extent that he exercises good lordship, or rather good shepherdship, their well-being is purely instrumental to his other goals. And as economy and civilization has grown, the top of the inequality pyramid has gotten higher and higher. The possibility of somebody with the relative social power of a Julius Caesar is inconceivable not just before the coming of the Agrarian Age, but before the coming of writing, before the coming of the state, before the coming of all of the ideological apparatuses of human organization, evolved and developed in the years of between minus 1000 and 1. And the possibility of somebody with the relative social power of a Jeff Bezos or a Joe Biden, or in their own way of a Taylor Swift or a George Clooney, that is not possible until our day. Once the Agrarian Age arrives, actually strike that. The Agrarian Age arrives in minus 6,000, and we're not really sure what happens between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. Once the city-states of Sumer and Akkad and the Kingdom of Egypt arises, it looks as though Agrarian Age societies rapidly become about as unequal as they could be. It looks as if they were much more, as if they were as unequal, in the sense that if they were much more unequal, then people would simply die, the civilizations would die off and vanish. Malthusian dynamics appear to keep lower-class standards of living at the Malthusian warranted population growth set point, given the marriage and other demographically relevant institutes of society, and whatever else is produced in the society goes to a relatively leisured, although not necessarily unstressed, upper class. The upper class maintains its dominion in its standard of living by virtue of its effective monopoly of coercive violence, which can often be exercised against its own members, via its monopoly of weapons and its training, and by enforcing exit from its numbers, either through violent death or through some process of dérogaance. The coming of the imperial, commercial, and then the industrial revolution, that sees a change in the character of the elite, from one that is primarily one of military landlord aristocrats and, where the centralized state is strong enough to collect taxes, state servants, with an admixture of slave lords, to one of merchant princes, industrial capitalists, and employers, with again for a long time a strong admixture of slave lords. The coming of the Industrial Revolution also appears to see a steep rise in income inequality, but that inequality is then eroded by the coming of democracy and the rise of the social insurance state. The past 35 years, however, have seen the coming of a second Gilded Age, the rise, especially in the United States, of a plutocratic upper class that is now much richer relative to the wealth of the rest of the population than any upper class ever, save possibly for the robber barons of the first Gilded Age, at the height of the Industrial Revolution expansion of manufacturing around the year 1900. Now, there are those who argue that our modern-day inequality is not nearly as burdensome on society as previous inequality, because the stakes are lower. It is not as though whether you are rich or poor determines whether you live or die, or whether your children are healthy or are stunted. Do note, however, that we've seen a degree of this very sharp edge of inequality return over the past year. And indeed, there is some truth to this. As John Maynard Keynes liked to say, it is much better for someone to be a tyrant with respect to their bank balance than to be a tyrant over other people directly. On the other hand, few tyrants would decide, as Purdue Pharmaceuticals, under the lash of the Sackler families and its other owners' demands for profits, did, that it should addict as many people as possible to oxycodone. Few tyrants would decide, as Mark Zuckerberg did, that allowing Alex Jones free rein to spread moral poison and misinformation on Facebook was worth it. Why? Because he, Mark, could then sell ads for overpriced gold funds and fake diabetes cures to his terrified audience, to Alex Jones's terrified audience, whose eyeballs were then glued to the screen. Naughty questions deserving of thought. One way to look at it: even a well-functioning market economy, with perfect competition and all the appropriate Pigouvian taxes and bounties to compensate for externalities, that does not maximize any sensible societal well-being function. It does maximize a societal well-being function, but the one that the market economy, even when the market economy works optimally in the sense of an externality-free, perfectly competitive Arrow de Brue-Mackenzie sense, but it maximizes as a societal well-being function in which each person's well-being counts in proportion to roughly the square of their wealth. And for anyone with any utilitarian leanings whatsoever, this is monstrous and disgusting. Even if you are not a utilitarian, you had better be damned sure that you like society's distribution of wealth, and really do think that those with 5 times the money really do deserve 20 times as much social power to get the good things of life and exercise power over others, before you approve of the inequality in society. Food for thought.